doesn't just affect Muslims, but members of other communities as well. But the proponents of Islamophobia say that Islamophobia isn't racism, as Islam is not a race. So any discussion on this issue, I feel, needs to start with some sort of definition of what it actually is. At this point, I think it's important to remind ourselves that there are many different forms of racism, including cultural racism, where one is seen as inferior due to their cultural practices. And with this in mind, academics such as Dr. Chris Allen, in his book called Islamophobia, gave a chronological history of the word in Britain before defining it largely as an ideology similar to racism, which defines Islam and Muslims as the other. Arun Kanani, in the introduction to his book, The Muslims Are Coming, also addressed the issue by saying, quote, "The usual objection in defining it in this way is that Muslims are not a race. But since all racisms are socially and politically constructed, rather than relying on the reality of the biological race itself, it is perfectly possible for cultural markers associated with Muslimness, such as forms of dress, rituals, language, etc., to be turned into racial signifiers," end quote. Now, it is really interesting that Mr. Kanani said that racism is a social and political construct, as according to my opinion, one of the biggest mechanisms we have today to form public perceptions and public opinions is actually the war on terror. And this link hasn't gone unnoticed, even by some members of the public who were previous police officers. So, for example, Dr. Robert Lambert, in his report, Islamophobia and Anti-Muslim Hate Crime, UK Case Studies 2010, is quoted to say, quote, "Above all, the war on terror has set the tone for creating a climate of fear in the UK in which suspicion depicted towards fellow citizens who are Muslims has become intrusive and pejorative, creating a negative stereotyping of the worst kind," end quote. The war on terror is nothing but the continuation of policies crafted by neocons such as Richard Perle in the early 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union. However, it was Samuel P. Huntington's theory of the clash of civilizations that formed the ideological foundations of the war on terror, as this theory serves to whitewash any social and political factors that may have made a greater contribution towards this clash. It is also worthy to note that this is the same Samuel P. Huntington who said in his book, Who Are We? And he made a quote saying, "The ideal enemy for America would be ideologically hostile, racially and culturally different, and militarily strong enough to pose a credible threat to American security." With terms such as ideologically hostile and racially and culturally different, you can sense how the other is constructed as inferior and confrontational. Regarding the war on terror, it is a war that is fought on two fronts, militarily abroad and ideologically at home. And I would argue that it is the ideological aspect of the war on terror that sustains it as a whole and lays solid foundations for otherizing Muslims, as this is also referred to by Dr. Nafiz Mossadegh Ahmed in his latest article, which is obviously provocatively entitled "White Supremacists at the Heart of Whitehall." He says, "Behind the facade of concern of terrorism is a network of extremist neoconservative ideologues, hell-bent on promoting discrimination and violence against Muslims and political activists who criticize Israel and Western government policies. The ideological aspect of the war on terror has not created but amped up the volume of Islamophobia by ensuring that funds are available to organizations and individuals, and hence this has spawned an industry of self-professed terrorism experts, whilst also giving what Hamid Dabashi terms as native informants a very lucrative career. One example of this is the self-professed expert on terrorism is the Henry Jackson Society's Douglas Murray, whose racist vitriol against Muslims, as well as having strong connections with the neocons both over here and the United States, is well known and therefore is a fully fledged proponent and supporter of the government's domestic policies at home. Another example is the Quilliam Foundation, set up by two ex-members of Hizb ut-Tahrir whose reports have been very influential in forming the Conservative government's Prevent agenda. However, they have had a greater presence in the media after the identification of Mohammed Emwazi as Jihadi John. And there was one particular interview on Sky News with Quilliam Foundation's Haras Rafiq that I found pretty interesting. In the interview, him and the interviewer, they were discussing and trying to dismiss the idea of disillusion playing a part in radicalization, as those who were radicalized had good opportunities and a good education. Haras said, quote, that it's rather an ideology than a lack of opportunities, end quote, which I think is rather telling, as this serves to substitute the theory of Samuel P. Huntington's Clash of Civilization, where it's not so much civilizational, but rather becomes one based solely on ideology. This is the angle used to justify terrorism, which is serving to underplay any social or political facts that may have also contributed towards one's radicalization. Now, I'm not denying ideology. I used to work for a Muslim prison mentoring project where we would give religious mentoring to vulnerable Muslims affected by this ideology. And also, with us doing the service, we were also targeted by the Quilliam Foundation. So I found it a bit hypocritical that Haras Rafiq would say this when we were dealing with the ideology of extremists. So in my opinion, ideology plays a part, but it's through this experience that I learned that you can't just tackle ideology. There were also a lot of disaffection, not just disillusion, disaffection. The feeling of not being satisfied by the system or those in power that played a part in making them want to seek out more radical voices and communities. This is also supported by those in terrorism studies such as Louise Richardson, who said in her book, What Terrorists Want. She quotes as saying, I suggest that the causes of terrorism are not to be found in objective conditions of poverty or privation or in a ruthless quest for domination, but rather a lethal cocktail that combines a disaffected individual, an enabling community, and a legitimizing ideology. So in order to conclude, the war on terror is something that is bound to fail. It is also something that is spewing out virulent forms of racism and Islamophobia due to the organizations and individuals that support and sustain it. And their work is something that is not going to itself tackle radicalization. It's actually going to imbue it, and basically it's going to strengthen it. So from my understanding, it's crucial that we as an organization, we as individuals, oppose this war on terror on every single level. Thank you.
Thank you.